welcome back. It is Chris Nichols here from PetaPixel, and today we are reviewing the iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max specifically. We've got a beautiful location. We're out here in San Jose. We're just gonna be exploring this beautiful city and all it has to offer. So you're gonna see a whole bunch of locations as we go on our little tour of this gorgeous city. Let's get to it. Okay, so I think it's very important to point out that I'm going to be approaching today's review really from the standpoint as a photographer and Jordan from the standpoint as a videographer. And so because of that, we're not testing the entire phone's features. We're really focusing on, in my case, the 3-year cameras, and in Jordan's case, all the video capabilities that the iPhone 15 Pro has to offer. I also want to point out, I'm going to be shooting the iPhone 15 Pro Max predominantly today, and Jordan's going to be shooting on an iPhone 15 Pro like he is right now. You definitely want to pay attention as he's changing scenes to the text below, because he will say whether he's shooting standard profiles, HDR, ProRes. We're going to test everything today. And now this is going to be the first video we've done in HDR output, so if you have an HDR display, I would absolutely watch this video on that HDR display. If not, it's still going to look great. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 rear cameras that we have on the iPhone 15 Pro, and we'll also talk about what we have on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. So the main camera, your primary tool. So we have a 24mm full frame equivalent. We're getting f1.78 as our aperture, 2.44 micron pixel density pitch when binned. This is exactly the same size, sensor, and lens assembly that we're getting on the iPhone 14 Pro. If it is changed in any way, it is minor. Now when it comes to the ultra-wide lens, we have a 13mm full frame equivalent f2.2, and this again is basically the exact same specifications we find on the iPhone 14 Pro. And when it comes to the telephoto lens, we have a 77mm full frame equivalent f2.8 on the iPhone 15 Pro. Specification-wise, again, it's the exact same thing as the iPhone 14 Pro. Apple does say that there are new coatings on these lenses, minor changes, but essentially, the long story short, we have the exact same lens assemblies from the iPhone 14 Pro as we do on the 15 Pro. Okay, but we do have one big change when it comes to lenses, and that's on the iPhone 15 Pro Max model specifically. We don't have a 77mm telephoto lens. We actually have a brand new 5x 120mm full frame equivalent lens, f2.8, that actually Jordan is shooting with right now. So yes, you do have to get the top of the line model, but it might actually be worth the extra price. Okay, so we've talked about focal lengths, now let's talk about resolution. So to keep this simple, the 13mm camera, the 77mm camera, and the new 120mm camera, all 12 megapixels. The main camera, of course, is a 48 megapixel quad Bayer sensor, just like we saw in the iPhone 14 Pro. But there is an interesting difference here now. So before, unless you were shooting Apple Pro RAW files at 48 megapixels, you were getting 12 megapixel output out of the main camera. Now what we're getting out of the main camera is actually an option to shoot 24 megapixels. And Apple's doing something interesting to get this 24 megapixel resolution. So first off, they're still doing their smart HDR combining of multiple photos at 12 megapixel output, but then they're also combining that with a 48 megapixel resolution shot, and that's how they're getting this 24 megapixel output. The other thing I want to mention too is we don't just have to shoot Apple Pro RAW, we can also now shoot 48 megapixel HEIF files, however you want to say it. So just like this beautiful tree, you could say that Apple's older lenses are being propped up by their brand new A17 processor. Okay, now we got a pretty hot day out here, but it's interesting, the camera's getting roasty toasty. I think Jordan was saying his is getting a little hot there to hold too. And I got a brief flash, like iPhone camera needs to cool down, but that went away, so I can still shoot. Okay, so you may know this about me already, but I'm not an Apple iPhone user. I've never owned one. This is my first time actually shooting seriously on one. And one thing that I know a lot of the Apple iPhone users have is this little switch here. And this switch, I guess, puts your phone into silent mode, do not disturb, I don't know, you can turn off notifications, that kind of thing, shut down the ringer. Anyways, that's now not here anymore. Instead, we've got this little button, and this is customizable. Now, you can still use this as your silent button, but you can also now customize it to do many different things. And as a photographer, I really like the fact that I can set it up to start and stop video recording. I can use it to just hold down and press and bring up my camera module immediately. I'm using that a lot today. And then I can even take pictures with that same button after I've done that. And I'm finding it really handy in a street photography situation. This does shave off just a little bit of time, and when you're shooting on the street like this, that's absolutely invaluable. So good, Jordan.
Yes.
Praise me. All right, so for this next talk, we tried to find a statue of an apple. We couldn't. The best we could do here is, I think it's an apricot or a nectarine or a peach or something like that. But anyways, Jordan clearly has an obsession with butt cracks and butt crack shaped objects. So what I want to talk about next is this. If you've seen any of the marketing material on the iPhone 15 Pro or Pro Max, you've probably seen the mention of 7 cameras. Now, you're going to have your 24mm main camera. You're going to now have a new 28mm equivalent and 35mm equivalent. You're going to have a 48mm 2x crop, and then you're going to have your telephoto, whether it's the 77mm or the 120mm, depending on whether you get the Pro or the Pro Max. So, you know, every time that we do these videos, I know they always seem very well edited and polished because Jordan does a very good job. But
thanks, Chris.
You're welcome. But there's always what's going on in the background, and it's always a struggle. I mean, that's just life. And our struggle today, we've been trying to upload our podcast, and the hotel that we're staying at, the Wi-Fi is really spotty. So, you know, we went to a Japanese garden. It was lovely this morning, but they just don't have Wi-Fi. And then we're still trying to upload this. We went back to the hotel. It hasn't finished. So then we go to Santana Row, we have a nice lunch, we're using their Wi-Fi, it's spotty as well. We just can't get this video uploaded. So now we find ourselves in a parking lot in San Jose somewhere, I'm not sure where we are, at a public library, and Jaren's inside getting this episode uploaded with the free Wi-Fi at the library. So this is what we deal with. So Jordan and I are sitting in the car, and I thought, why don't we talk about a handling issue here that I'm having on the iPhone 15. One thing I'm finding a little bit funny that I'm using quite a bit is the color profiles. And I think a lot of users maybe don't use this. And I know you're probably just telling me this is an Apple thing, just get over it. But I have to go down here to the sub-menu, push that, then I can choose all my different color things, dramatic, warm, mono, silver tone, and I'm liking the black and white options. So when I go in there and then I exit out, I get this lovely little reminder up here, these 3 rings. And that's great because I can just very easily touch it and go to something else. That seems great. The only thing I'm finding strange is if I go back to original and kick out, that disappears. And that just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know, are we really saving that much real estate up there? Is there a way to make it stay on permanently? I don't know, you tell me. The only thing I can find out is never go back to the original color setting, go to Vivid or something, and then it basically stays up there all the time. I don't know, is that weird, Jordan? Is that just me?
It's kind of annoying.
All right, so the next stop on our little road trip journey here through San Jose is Japantown. It's pretty quiet though, but it does give us an opportunity to talk about now depth of field, because one thing I really wanted to test when I saw the announcement, the new 120mm lens in this, what's the depth of field going to be like? You know, I mean, it's an f2.8 lens, but it's also a very small sensor. So are we going to get nice shallow depth of field considering that telephoto range? Well, have a look at this shot here. I mean, you are getting a fairly shallow depth of field, but it's still not giving you that really soft background that just goes into blur. So what you're going to have to do here, I think, is still in a lot of cases use Apple's portrait mode to artificially give you that shallower depth of field. Now in the past, I've been a little bit wary of using this portrait mode because it can look quite artificial, especially around the hair and shoulders. It was better on the iPhone 14 Pro series, but actually on the iPhone 15 Pro here, it's actually even better. It is improved. It's still not perfect. If you look hard for it, you can see some issues, but honestly, I don't think that most users are even gonna mind, and it was quite seamless. But here's the best part, because on the iPhone 15s, we have a brand new feature now. You don't have to commit to going into portrait mode to create those depth maps and then that artificial bokeh. What you can actually do now is just take a picture, and if you see this little F symbol at the bottom, you can see it there. That first off tells you that the camera is detecting portraits and then actually saving depth maps automatically, even if you're not in portrait mode. And what's great now is that I can choose after the fact of taking the picture whether I want to actually apply the portrait effect or not. Now previously, if I shot in portrait mode, I could choose not to use the portrait mode afterwards. But here, I don't have to make any of those choices. If I take a picture and at any later date, it's got a portrait detection in there, either pets or people, I can then just say, oh yeah, I would actually prefer to have a softer background. Go in afterwards into editing and choose that. I can also choose between different areas that I want to have in focus. So this is just nice. It just means that I don't have to really worry about, oh, was I in portrait mode? I can simply just take shots and then decide later. And I really like that convenience. Ooh, I almost forgot. So this 120mm lens does have a pretty advanced stabilizer. It's now 3-axis, up, down, left, right, and then forward, back, which to me is really more autofocusing than stabilization. But I will say I haven't had any problems hand holding the 120mm lens. But the true test, how's this for a segue, would actually be video. So let's go over to Jordan now and talk about video capabilities on the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max.
All right, so because we've got a really contrasty scene right now, we've switched over to recording in the ProRes log format that I was really excited about. I mean, we've seen third-party companies offering their version of like a log profile for iPhone, but this is a first-party solution, so it's going to take advantage of all the dynamic range that this sensor is actually capturing. My biggest issue with exposing log is there's absolutely no built-in LUT for it, so you're going to be looking at a gray, ungraded image instead of what it's going to look like after you apply some grading to it. But the other big limitation is there's no kind of metering controls on this, and log can be very difficult to expose correctly, so I am trusting Apple's auto exposure to do a good job. Now, this is definitely going to help in contrasty situations, but we might still run into situations where your highlights are clipping and things like that, but this is a great creative option to have. My biggest concern is it's only available when we're recording ProRes. This is something they didn't really highlight in the keynote presentation, so if you want to shoot those nice small H.265 files, you're out of luck. You've got to deal with the default profiles for those. But you can record those giant ProRes files right into your phone if you've got enough capacity, but a huge upgrade is we can now use the USB-C port on these and output it right to an SSD. But what Apple didn't mention is it doesn't have to be an SSD. You can also send it out to a card reader with solid-state memory. So my buddy Alex Mitchell was like, can we just shoot these giant files to a CF Express card? And I tested it, and absolutely you can. Straight to a card reader, CF Express, and that's fast enough you'll be able to record 4K 60 HDR ProRes right to the card. This is a great workaround if you don't want to fill up your phone. But what's absolutely bizarre is you can only output ProRes files to those SSDs. If you want to output the smaller files and just have them directly recorded to an SSD or a memory card, it's not going to give you that capability. And one thing Apple talked about quite a bit is the ability to smoothly move through all of your different focal ranges. And on the iPhone 15 Pro Max, that means from 13 mils up to 120 millimeters. But what we're finding here, it moves from the 0.5 lens all the way through your normal lenses quite effectively. But when it moves over to that 5x lens, there's kind of a parallax snap that occurs, which looks very artificial, very disjointed. So I would use this if I was moving through smaller adjustments like a tiny zoom in the middle of a shot for a bit more cinematic effect. But what I really wish this gave you the ability to do is, first of all, not have that parallax issue, but also just a button that you could push to make it zoom out or zoom in. The current kind of jog dial setup they have makes it really easy to accidentally screw up your zoom and wind up having to do it over again, because I think we're on like our 10th take right now. So sadly, this does mark the end of our time here in San Jose, but we're really looking forward to getting back to Calgary. I'm going to take a look at the video files through Final Cut. Chris is going to run the photos through Lightroom and really analyze the image quality from the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max. But what's also cool is Apple was good enough to send these phones back to Canada so we can run some more tests there from a much more, I don't know, cold, less inviting climate.
All right, we're back in Calgary, Alberta. I know Jordan said we were going to be returning to yucky old cold Canada, but it turns out we got a gorgeous summer here and it's just lovely. So we've taken some more samples, we've taken a look at the stuff that we shot back in San Jose, and I think we've been able to evaluate things well enough that we can now give you our final thoughts on the image quality on the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max when it comes to stills and video. Okay, so let's start things off with stills, talking about just the kind of image files we can take on the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max. So you have your 48 megapixel Apple Pro RAW files. As usual, we've seen this before, and this gives you tons of detail, great sharpness, but also the room to push and pull in post like you would with any photographic RAW file. And so I do like that we see the return of that. One thing that we do have new though on the 15 Pro and Pro Max is now 48 megapixel HEIF files. Now, The benefit here, you're still getting that excellent detail and sharpness. You still have some room to push and pull, and the heat files do record an extended dynamic range. So they do capture quite a bit of light and dark at the same time, but drastically smaller file sizes. I mean, that's kind of the key here. So if you really want that sharpness and detail, but you don't want the file size of a full RAW, this is a nice option. But one thing to remember, those 48 megapixel RAW files, they're not going to take full advantage of HDR displays unless you push and pull them afterwards to do so. This is why I think the majority of iPhone users are really going to enjoy the 24 megapixel file format, because here, right out of camera, you're getting HDR photos, you're still getting a great amount of detail, much improved over the other 12 megapixel files, and so I think a lot of people are really going to go this way instead. For me personally, as a photographer, I think this is how I'd approach it. I'd probably use 48 megapixel HEIF files the least, to be honest. I would rely on that 24 megapixel file when I just want to have nice looking images right out of the box, or I'm going to go to the 48 megapixel Apple Pro RAW as normal and then really be able to push and pull to my heart's content. But you know, all these improvements we've talked about so far with resolution largely have to do with the main camera. Even the 28 and 35 millimeter lenses, which we would say are effectively digital crops. But keep in mind that the 28 mm and 35 millimeter lenses are actually incorporating a 48 megapixel shot. So you're getting that same boost to the detail. You're getting the 24 megapixel file, and the image quality was good. So really, as skeptical I was at the start, I really just consider it now to give you 3 extra lenses. If you want that 24 millimeter field of view, great. If you want 28 or 35, great. You can even set that to be the default for the camera when you turn it on. I don't know why I'd want 35, you know, I don't like those, but overall, I actually was really pleased with the image quality out of our artificial lenses. You know, having this new 24 megapixel file size actually really does show what you were missing with the 12 megapixel pictures, but on the iPhone 15, there's still some situations where you're shooting 12 megapixels. So now that we have this 24 megapixel mode on the main camera, I can't really think of a situation where I'd want to go back down to the older 12 megapixel format, because you do notice there then the over sharpening a little bit, the over processed kind of look to it, some of the lack of detail, and of course you also notice this on the other cameras, the ultra wide and the 2 tellies, because you're again at 12 megapixels. Even when you go into night mode, although it is improved and you do get a nice range of tones, maybe a wider range of tones than you would get if you processed a 48 megapixel HEIF or RAW file format, you still notice that we're losing a lot of detail. Not a lot of noise, but certainly a loss of detail. And so even in those situations, I might be tempted to just go with the 48 megapixel file and try to work it to keep that detail that's inherent there. So most of the improvements to photo image quality are based on the new A17 processor and the new modes, but let's see if that also rings true for Jordan when he talks about the video image quality.
So when it comes to image quality, I feel like iPhones are kind of batting back and forth with other people like Google when it comes to photographic image quality, but for the longest time, the consensus among me and everyone who used this is the iPhones have the best video, but that doesn't mean they didn't have problems. I mean, they were notorious when you're shooting in a high contrast scene for something I affectionately call wax face, where the face loses all detail, turns just very monochromatic, and it looks terrible and you can't fix it in post. Now, I'm not going to say I never ran into this issue, but it's much less prevalent now with the iPhone 15 Pro. And what's really interesting is when it happened in a very high contrast situation, I was able to get Chris looking sort of like a human being again in post, as opposed to some horrifying monster, which was the case before. But the big news now is that we've now got this new log profile, and there were definitely some usability issues that I mentioned before, but the big thing that really surprised me is that the quality on this, if you're shooting in good light like we are now, is absolutely fantastic. I found it extremely easy to hand grade. I was able to make it look really good very, very easily. But the thing to remember is Apple can do a ton of computational tricks to improve low light performance in photography by stacking images. They don't have nearly that flexibility when you're recording video. So if you're planning to shoot indoors, especially in like real low light, the image quality is going to look like, let's be honest, it's going to look bad. That is still smartphone's Achilles heel. So when I would really like to use this is in good light like we've got now, even in high contrast situations. Now that I've got log, I wouldn't worry about that at all. But just be aware, if you're going to go inside or out at night, your video quality is going to be bad. Okay, so what about cinematic mode, which I was not a huge fan of back on the iPhone 13 Pro. It just looked incredibly fake, like you had some bad cutouts in it and a lot of depth map errors. Well, I think because we've got a better processor on these cameras, it is actually quite a bit better than what we saw before, less of that cutout effect. But looking at my footage on a 4K display, I was definitely still seeing lots of depth map errors, a lot of weirdness in it. And I don't think this is going to be a problem if you're just playing it back on the phone, throwing it on social media, but For me personally, I think I'm just going to leave cinematic mode off, especially because if you're using the main camera, you can get sort of shallow depth of field just optically. So this is the best smartphone that I've used for video, but there's still room for improvement. What's nice is Apple is being quite flexible about actually letting that happen. I was very worried when Apple announced their new log format that if you wanted the most dynamic range from this camera, you would have to shoot it with their default video camera app. But they're keeping the API open, so third-party app developers are going to be able to take advantage of the beautiful log image here, but give us stuff that we absolutely need, like some metering tools or a preview LUT built into those applications. I can't wait to start shooting video with some of the other third-party video recording tools out there. So as long as you're willing to spring for some third-party apps, I would fully suspect that we're going to get this beautiful image quality with a ton of great usable video tools, and that's going to make this a very powerful video platform.
Okay, so here's my final thoughts, especially being someone who's never used an iPhone for photography before. I mean, first off, I think Apple has this balancing act that they've always had to deal with, and that is that the vast majority of their users just want things to be simple, to work out of the camera and be visually pleasing. And so I think things like the 24 megapixel mode are really going to be a good hit there. And then if you're wanting to be more discerning, maybe play with your files a little bit more, get into RAW files, I think Apple is still just going to do this thing where they rely on keeping the API open and letting third-party app developers create apps that can run your cameras in a more advanced way and give you more control. And I think that is pretty appropriate. And so then the other thought I have is that using the 15 Pro and Pro Max, I would personally rely quite heavily on the main camera. When I first heard of the 28 and 35mm lenses, I thought these are just gonna be nasty digital crops, but we're still getting that benefit of going up to 24 megapixels. And so actually I think that this opens up some neat lens ranges and still gives you good image quality. I would rely on those quite a bit. With the telephoto, I mean, it's nice to have the new 120mm, absolutely. If you really want that format, that's why you go to the Pro Max. Otherwise, stick to the Pro and have the 77, but image quality wise on both, they looked quite similar and they're not that impressive. I mean, they look very similar to what we saw with the iPhone 14 Pro. So anyways, I really enjoyed using these phones for photography, and I feel like any of the complaints I had with portrait mode not being realistic enough or, you know, having low resolution over processed shots, Apple's actually done quite a bit to improve that situation going forward. I know you guys have lots of questions, so leave those in the comments below. Let us know what you think. Please do subscribe to the socials and subscribe to the channel as well. We would love that. Check out the PetaPixel podcast. You can see it here on the same YouTube channel or all your favorite podcasting apps. Just search for PetaPixel Podcast, and don't forget to leave your comments there as well, because we answer those too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon with more episodes from PetaPixel.